Hello, and thank you for joining us for a pre-concert conversation about the upcoming concert, part of our 2021 reimagined season. This concert was titled Prodigies, and you'll soon see why. Each of our composers on this program have distinguished themselves at a very young age as composers of music of merit. First on our program, of course, is one of the most legendary prodigies of all time, Felix Mendelssohn. We're performing a string symphonia, his first. He wrote it when he was 12 years old. And he wrote 13 of them, or 12 full symphonias, strings for strings, and a 13th large movement. There is some reason to believe that if he had passed at an early age, earlier than he did, that these symphonias would stand as objects of admiration and in their own right as compositions by someone of high standing. The fact that he wrote these pieces between the ages of 12 and 14 is astonishing. The first Symphonia is exuberant. It has all the markings of Felix Mendelssohn as a mature composer. It's hard to believe that in the short time he was studying music, that he somehow brought into his soul and into his mind the technique necessary to create a work that is coherent, that is beautiful, and that is fun to play as well. Mendelssohn was not only a child prodigy, but he was someone who was surrounded by great wealth and great support. It was of importance for him to be highly trained in all of the arts and in as much knowledge as was available to him through private tutoring. He had, as a young child, even younger than 12, had conversations with the great writer, the German writer Goethe. And Goethe found him absolutely fascinating and a wonderful conversationalist. One would love to have been a fly in the wall for those conversations, to hear this young child speaking with one of the great minds of the 18th and early 19th century. It sort of blows my mind, that's for sure. The music itself is in 3 movements. They are definitely looking at the tradition of the symphony as established by Joseph Haydn and Johann Sebastian Bach's sons, Christian Bach and also Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, each of whom were, of course, contemporaries of Haydn and Mozart, and were branching out on their own, taking their father's sort of Baroque style, kind of old-fashioned style of composition by the 18th century, the late 18th century, and turning it in new directions into a more the more refined and classical style that we recognize in the music of Mozart and Haydn. The teacher of Mendelssohn at this time, his last name was Zelter, and he knew the music of Bach and, of course, knew personally Haydn and others, and celebrated that music and, of course, brought that into his teaching of this young genius, Felix. So when we encounter this first Symphonia, we are going to hear someone who is still taking in the models of his elders. But if you listen very closely, you will see and hear snippets that could come easily from his masterpieces, the Midsummer Night's Dream, the Third and Fourth Symphonies, the Scottish and Italian symphonies, and other works of his that we, of course, associate as being pure Mendelssohn. That lightness of touch, the idea of color instrumental color and combinations that give us such delight. He rarely is melancholy, but when he is, such as in his violin concerto, only someone can handle handle this beautiful balance of melancholy and seriousness with such a lightness of touch. That is Mendelssohn's gift, and we find it even in this early Symphonia, a 12-year-old's work. While the first movement might have a few over earnest cadential gestures, we find that he uses that idea of the cadence, of coming to the end of a phrase, a kind of amen in the phrase. He uses that to great effect in the development section of this first movement, where he takes us to keys remote from the original key, and even surprises us with a few deceptive cadences. So he's having a lot of fun with the technique of harmony, of the language, the rhetoric that has been established in terms of harmonic language that composers use to create phrases, to create periods in music. And the young Mendelssohn has a lot of fun with that. It's very exuberant opening. The second movement takes us into a minor key. It's a beautiful song, again, but with this lightness of touch, even as a 12-year-old. He doesn't, the tears aren't too big in this. It's just gloriously beautiful. And this second movement forms a kind of, although it is a slow movement, it also has a three-part figure, such as a minuet trio movement would have. And listen carefully to the contrasting trio section, because it has this winding melody that carries through all the string sections. And if you were to speed it up, you would certainly hear it as a section from his Scottish Symphony, or even the Tarantella of his Fourth Symphony, that beautiful melodic weaving that only he knows how to do. The textures in the third movement, again, we definitely, he sets us up for a grand finale. He uses fugal writing to show off his counterpoint skills. But even as this might have been for him and for his teacher, a kind of musical exercise on the road to mastering form, he's creating art even as this young genius. The exuberance of it comes through. You will hear textures that sound very Baroque. We won't forget, of course, that Zelter introduced Felix Mendelssohn to the works of Johann Sebastian Bach, and it was Mendelssohn who brought Bach back onto the main stage of the concert hall with a glorious production of the St. Matthew Passion by Sebastian Bach that really put him back into everyone's mind as one of the greatest composers of all time. So we owe Mendelssohn a great debt of thanks for that. But we can also hear how he, as a young composer, engaged with the older master and created certain textures and harmonic progressions in the last movement, particularly with fugal writing, with the counterpoint. So enjoy this miraculous piece by a 12-year-old prodigy. This has been a joy to study, and also an opportunity for us as musicians to engage with Mendelssohn at his freshest and at his most ambitious. This month in the Maryland Theater, we were going to present a brand new piece of music that we had commissioned along with the Johns Hopkins Symphony by the immensely gifted composer James Lee III. It was his second symphony, which I know we'll hear in next season, but I really wanted you to be able to hear his fantastic music this season, and fortunately, our composer has written a symphony, his first symphony that was for strings, which works perfectly for a COVID orchestra. Our instrumentalists on stage are eager to delve into this excerpt from his first symphony, the third movement, called The Eternal Present. And I am eager to speak with Dr. Lee and welcome him right now. Thank you, Dr. James Lee III, for joining us. You are one of the hottest composers writing for classical music right now. Your music is heard across the world and throughout the United States with performances by major orchestras, including our own Baltimore Symphony, including the Detroit Symphony, whose music director, former music director Leonard Slatkin, was my own mentor. So I feel that though you and I haven't met in person yet, we will once we begin our rehearsals next week. But I feel like we have some musical commonality. We're both Michiganders. You were born in the southwest part of the state, and I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where you also did some doctoral work and studied with Michael Doherty, whose work we commissioned a couple seasons ago. So we have some things in common, and I look forward to talking to you about this marvelous piece of music that you've written. It's the third movement of your first symphony, called The Eternal Present. And that's sort of the heart and soul of the middle of our concert. And I have been listening to your music. I especially appreciate I think it's called Sukkot, through Orion's Nebula, referring to the Hebrew festival, Sukkot, and also a passage from Revelations in the New Testament, the harvest festival that is referred to there. So, which leads me into what we are missing, and that is the second symphony that we have commissioned from you. I'm assuming it is ready to go, or has COVID put a little bit, slowed your progress down on that? Because I know you have a lot of commissions and a lot of new music coming out, being performed in the next few seasons.
Yes, it's good to be here. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, you mentioned the second symphony. Actually, I finished that symphony last spring, so that's been ready to go since I think March or April last year. Usually, I am pretty good when it comes to deadlines and being able to complete my works ahead of time. So if anything I might want to change, I have enough time before the work needs to be delivered.
Fantastic. That warms my heart. I can't wait to see the score then. And I know that we're going to be sharing the premiere with Jed Galen, who also conducts the Two Rivers Symphony nearby, Two Rivers Orchestra, in West Virginia, just across the Potomac from us in Shepherdstown. And but it's the Johns Hopkins Symphony that he conducts that will be sharing this wonderful premiere opportunity. So I'm looking forward to that. But let's go to your first symphony. It was written in, I believe, 2014. You've received so many awards and fellowships for your music, for your great talent. The first symphony, was it written while you were on Fulbright fellowship down in Brazil? I know it was written for an ensemble in Peru, I believe.
Yes.
But I was just wondering when you wrote it, and for whom you wrote it, and the reason why the symphony was called In This Generation. It's a 4-movement work. It's fairly standard in terms of an initial movement that sets out an argument, a second movement that's a dance movement, in this case a tarantella, the third movement, which we're performing, The Eternal Present, which is a kind of slow movement, although it quickens up, has a different rates of tempo, and then the fourth movement, which is a fugue. So in some ways you're nodding to tradition, but you're also, of course, bringing your own language in and making it your own. Can you tell us a little bit about how the third movement fits into the whole scheme of the First Symphony?
Okay, well, first of all, when I was in Brazil, I met with a friend of mine who was conducting in Peru. And he has this, or he used to have, he's not in Peru anymore, but he used to have this ensemble called the Camarata Unión there in Peru at the university where he was teaching. And I decided to compose this piece for him that he would perform the following season in Peru. This first symphony, the title In This Generation, is actually inspired by the New Testament and some prophecies in terms of when one sees certain signs, then they can expect the second coming to be in their particular generation. So then once we move on to the third movement is called the eternally present because it talks about like the omnipresence of God, the creator. And in that particular movement, there are various modes of emotions that are kind of expressed in that particular movement, especially contrasting relationships between humanity and God. So in one aspect, there's some music of peace and beauty and in terms of how a human's relationship with God would be. And then those who might be experiencing another type of relationship can really be towards the idea if they are more antagonistic or if they are going through some sort of chastisement and they look at God more as a harsh God because of their own acts. So that's some of the changing emotions or changing dynamics and tempos or tempi in that particular movement of the eternally present.
I love it that you have such a visionary internal story to this music. You, of course, started our program is called Prodigies. We have music of Korngold and Mendelssohn, who are famous for having created music early on in their lives. And you too, you began piano at 12, if I am correct about an interview that I read of yours. But the minute you started learning that instrument, you were clearly super gifted and you were already beginning to compose, if not before that, maybe even with your first piano concerto at 18. That's extraordinary. And luckily your gifts have been embraced and nurtured by wonderful teachers that you've had and also marvelous musical mentors, I'm sure, and also champions of your music, both here in the state of Maryland and at Morgan State, where you teach with your colleagues, and also just around the world and with all the major orchestras. I believe you have a Chicago Symphony premiere coming up this next season. Just remarkable and wonderful, and it's so wonderful to have your talent in the world of classical music. Obviously, as a composer, you're trying to figure out how to create and form musically that which you envision inside. And so you've given us this picture of a relationship with God, relationship with the eternal, in this central movement of the piece. I'm assuming that the first movement, which was called Preamble, is sort of an introduction or I don't know. I always think of the Constitution when I hear preamble, but I'm not sure that's what you were thinking exactly, but certainly an introduction. And then the second movement, the Tarantella, which of course the dance is so important in especially Christian tradition and imagery. And then this central movement, of course, the fugue, again, a joining of, it's a very kind of a cerebral experience for listeners as well, because of all the voices coming together and joining together in new relationships, but along certain rules. So this central movement sort of has to take us out of that tradition of the symphonic repertoire where we have the slow movement, but you mentioned the two ways of encountering the eternal. And indeed, the music comes up abruptly. It's in a certain, I guess you would call a moderate tempo before, and then it's interrupted by some gestures that are indeed almost violent, and then we move into something that's twice as fast, and the textures become more agitated and involved, and there's just a sort of thicker texture going on at that time. And then, of course, toward the end of the movement, the overall pulse goes back to its original, even though all the faster figuration that comes in the faster section continue a little bit until we slow down and then approach. There's a moment in this movement where the music climbs and climbs and climbs and reaches a point where it almost breaks apart and turns into trills. The strings become fast trills. It's all whole notes just moving slowly up. And I was, for me as a conductor, I want to know your intentions so that we can try to create that imagery, at least in our heads, as we make that music, so that we know your intent. And I've been just wondering, in some ways, what is happening at that moment where it just almost breaks. It's almost as if you're trying to create musical light, something that sparks or that breaks open. I'm just wondering what's going on there, so I can pass it on to the musicians and we can try to make that happen for you.
Sure. Well, it's interesting in this third movement, the eternally present, there is a passage in Revelation 12 that talks about this war in heaven. Heaven, it was paradise, or it is paradise. And how can there exist anything that is not harmonious and not full of beauty in paradise? So after a while, there is this element of jealousy that is growing. And as that jealousy grows from whom the Bible in Revelation, and also in the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, identifies as Lucifer, he ends up instigating a rebellion in heaven. And he was able to convince 1/3 of the angels that his case was something that they needed to, believe in and support. So as the strings continue to climb in around the eternally present there in that third movement, you have this intensity that just continues to grow until there's, this all-out war that is in heaven before the actual expulsion of Lucifer to this earth. And then finally, after that particular climax in the strings, then eventually, as the movement ends, it returns back to this peace and harmony in paradise after that one element of discontent was actually expelled.
It's, for me as a musician, so inspiring to see that image that you just explained to us, to see it sort of happening on the page, and to watch someone really work how to bring something that is a spiritual and that is in your imagination and your vision and the miraculous story of it, the miraculous truth of it onto the page in a way that is traditional, and in the form of the classical tradition. And it's been really wonderful discovering that, and also hearing that the things that are impressing me as I look at it on the page and imagine it in my ears. I will be getting to hear the players actually make the music next week when we begin our rehearsals, and you'll be joining us for that. So that's exciting for us to have you there too. But it's exciting for me to actually see you working that out on the page, and creating. It's really this. It's really what really excites me as a musician, and excites me about the music of today. About encountering people that are joining this long tradition of conversation, of musical conversation, but bringing such new visions and such new realities into to life for us, for our ears. It's clear that your spiritual life, your life of faith, is very important in everything that you write. I know that you have written music that celebrates America, of Harriet Tubman. You wrote an arrangement of the national anthem that I can't wait to do soon, and so many other works. But also your personal faith has really, you are always connected to that with your writing. I'm just wondering if you want to talk a little bit about how you bring that into a tradition of concert music and into a concert hall that has that isn't always allied to the spiritual, but how you bring your audiences into your world of faith.
Okay, well, this really started when I was a student at the University of Michigan. When I was a student I was studying composition for my graduate program, but even before that, in my undergraduate, listening to various works, and then really once I explored composition, one day I listened to Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, and I thought that if he, as a Catholic composer, could really be inspired by his faith and produce this wonderful art of music, why could I not, in terms of my own faith, use some of those sources of inspiration for my own music? And I had studied the books of Daniel and Revelation, and done I've taught others in Bible studies on those particular topics. But I thought there's so much good imagery in those particular books. Why can I use that also in my source of inspiration? And I thought about, in terms of the concert hall, there are so many other subject matters that are presented. I thought this might be a nice counterpoint, so to speak, to the other works that were being presented on concerts, that it might introduce people to some of these ideas and some of these stories that they may have never heard before, and now they are hearing it, and maybe even thinking about learning a little bit more about them because of what they've heard in my music. And that's something that I always say, I want to reach to the inner soul of the listener to help them to really, or hopefully that my music really moves them in such a way that regardless of their background and their own faith, they can at least appreciate the musical art that I am producing, that really reaches them and moves them in a positive way.
Well, we're certainly honored to be able to present your work. We look forward to being part of the beginning of your of life of your second symphony, in terms of having it be performed and become alive in sound with live musicians next season. And in the meantime, I want to thank you for joining us for this marvelous conversation that gives us new insight into your music and your art. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'd just like to say one more thing. In terms of the second symphony, I think the title was a Hebrew word, aruka, and it actually means healing. So it's interesting, after all that we've experienced in this country and other countries in the world in terms of COVID and whatever other conflicts, it's interesting that hopefully after when things calm down a little bit more, that a title like this, healing, can really, it's really interesting to occur, to be performed in such a time that we live in.
I agree. I when I saw the title and knew the connection, I too felt that this would have been perfect for right now. When we planned this for for this month. I think last year we thought the pandemic would probably be over by now. At least we see a light at the end of the long road. But I agree with you. It is a very timely and prescient title, and also a piece of music that I can't help but feel has been brought forth for the reason of celebration at the end of what I hope will be the end of this long dark period that we've all been going through. And how wonderful that we will be able to come together with the work of yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We continue with a performance of Erich Korngold, and I should say Erich Wolfgang Korngold's Symphonische Serenade, Symphonic Serenade. Why I said his full name was because Wolfgang refers back, of course, to the famous Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, one of the earliest prodigies that we know of in classical music tradition. Not only Mendelssohn, but Mozart, of course, was well known as a composer, composing his earliest creations at the age of 7 and 9, his first symphony. They are not quite as well finished as those of Mendelssohn, who at the ripe old age of 12 created his first symphonia. But of course, Korngold was considered an even more amazing prodigy than even Mendelssohn. Part of that happened because, once again, Korngold was surrounded by a certain amount of wealth and opportunity and education, and also had a father who was quite famous as a music critic and was engaged in judgment of all the music that was being written at the time of Korngold's youth. And that included works of Gustav Mahler and Richard Strauss, all the greats of the late 19th and early 20th century. To be surrounded by that language of music and to hear one's father playing through brand new scores of Richard Strauss or Mahler or even Schoenberg must have been something for a young genius as Erich Korngold was. And when he created his first compositions, they engaged in this modern contemporary harmonic language that wasn't looking back to the ancients, Haydn and Mozart and even Beethoven, but was engaging in the music of his time. And because of that, I think the results were even more astonishing. And he was considered perhaps the greatest of all child prodigies because of the music he wrote was fully formed. In his early music, you don't necessarily hear snippets of things that will come in the future, as in Mendelssohn's Symphonia, but rather you hear a fully grown, fully created work that fit in perfectly with the music of his time and had an enormous and sophisticated grasp of harmonic language, of form. He seemed to have become fully formed very early. The piece that we're playing, however, happens late in his life. This was written in 1947 when he was 50 years old. He had experienced a heart attack, and I think that informs some of the spirit of this movement, of this music, which is a serenade. Korngold was considered not only a child prodigy, but enfant terrible in the city of Vienna, where he was born and grew up. He wasn't born in Vienna, but he grew up in Vienna. And it was this world of success that he left because of World War II. He was Jewish, and his life was forfeit if he did not escape. And luckily, his talent brought him to Hollywood. He worked in Hollywood for several years before it was clear that he needed to get out in order to survive. And one of his first projects in Hollywood was to transcribe and rearrange the music of Felix Mendelssohn, his Midsummer Night's Dream incidental music, for a movie that was directed by Max Reinhardt for Warner Brothers in the 30s. Because of this relationship with Warner Brothers, Korngold was able to travel between Vienna and Hollywood pretty smoothly during the 30s. And then, of course, it was clear in the late 30s that he needed to leave, which he did with his immediate family. He settled in to Hollywood and became one of the foremost film composers. Writing for the film was, as we think of it, a beautiful art form, something that when we think of John Williams or Hans Zimmer or any James Horner, something that has reached epic proportions and a high level of musical attainment. At the beginning, however, Korngold was quite a coup for the Warner Brothers to bring over a real composer, an established and important composer. And for Korngold, I think it was quite a change to move from music from the opera hall and the symphonic hall, concert hall, to the studio, and really create music that had to be of a certain length and fulfill a very specific niche in terms of joining with the drama that's going on the film. He was an innovator, and he was certainly one of the founders, along with Max Steiner and others, of that fully formed orchestral soundtrack that we love to hear in the films of Errol Flynn or Bette Davis from the 30s and 40s. He was a master of film scoring and became very, very famous for that, and also it was lucrative for him. Although he spent a lot of his money trying to save his colleagues and others who were suffering during the war. In the 40s, he wanted to step away from film composition. And perhaps his health that seemed to be deteriorating was another reason for him to retire from film writing and return to the concert hall. At the end of the Second World War, there was a great wish in the musical world for people to come together again and for music to flow from the concert stages. There was a hope that, especially on Erich Korngold's side, that he could return and live in Vienna as he had so successfully before the war. And so this piece that we're performing, the Symphonic Serenade, was written specifically for the Vienna Philharmonic to be conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler, who is one of the greatest conductors of all time, and certainly highly regarded. It must have been a very difficult reunion for Korngold to go back to Vienna because so much had changed. His publishers had flourished during Nazi times, and so had Furtwängler, and so had the Vienna Philharmonic that had rid itself of all of its Jewish musicians. So for a Jewish composer, even as he had been celebrated before the Second World War, to realize that he probably would not have survived and this music would not have been performed just a few years earlier, the reunion must have felt a little bit difficult. For Korngold himself, he wished to put everything aside and to just come back and get back to the life that he remembered from before. But it was not to be. the reception of this piece, although it did receive a performance by the Vienna Philharmonic, Furtwängler fell ill and Korngold had to conduct, although it received more performances later on with Furtwängler. It was coolly received because it was considered old-fashioned. The language that Korngold brought to this piece of music was the music was his compositional language that he had established before the war and during his work as a film composer. And it hadn't sort of developed in terms of becoming more contemporary. And the Viennese were cool, partly because I think that they were slightly resentful of someone coming back who had gained great wealth and recognition in a popular field of film, and now was coming back to a country that had been devastated by war through its own choice, but also through the I guess the changes that happen to people through war, but also artistically. The language had changed. It had become harsher, and it had become a more realistic representation of what was going on in Europe during the wartime. So there is a lot to think about when you are going to encounter this piece of music. In one way, it's nostalgic and very personal. In another way, it's trying to paper over or wash over, let bygones be bygones. I want to come back home. I want to perform and write music for my beloved friends in Vienna. There's something quite poignant about this piece of music in terms of where it fits into his life. He became sicker and sicker as the years went by, and he died at the early age of 60. He would write a few more works, but he really slowed down in his final decade. And the works he wrote are all serious works meant for the concert hall. And this was an effort to get back into the swing of things, I think. To call this piece a serenade allows the composer to take the music a little bit more lightly. Now, serenade can mean many things. It can mean lighthearted music, music of entertainment, music that can accompany other activities, but it can also mean, as in Mozart's famous Eine kleine Nachtmusik, it can also mean night music. And there is a whole aspect to this work that conjures up the night. Concert conjures up darkness, dreams, and illness and melancholy in a way as well. And of course, importantly, war. So the first movement, it could easily fit into a symphony as an opening movement with a beautiful theme, main theme, romantic, beautiful, with some agitation underneath. The piece was dedicated to his wife, and so one can't help but wonder if the theme indeed evokes the beauty and the love that he felt for this lovely woman. Who saved his life, brought him back from the brink after this heart attack and ill health, and was always a wonderful mainstay to him, supporting him in all of his efforts. The second movement is all pizzicato and all shadows. This is almost Mendelssohnian in a way, with a trio section that is very short and definitely comes from his brilliant work as a film writer. You can't help but think of this perhaps coming into a film by Lon Chaney or something where or a vampire film where there's lots of shadow and fleeting spirits flying about. It's a tour de force for orchestra. It reminds me again of the Tchaikovsky movements where everyone is pizzicatoing his own serenade, where you have all pizzicato. And then the third movement, which reminds me in some ways forms as Dr. Lee's work had a sort of spiritual third movement. This is also a movement that is called lento, but also religioso. So a sense that there is something spiritual going on in this movement. You can't help but hear that throughout. It does carry some of film writing in it. There's a visual aspect to it. One also thinks to the slow movement of Schumann's Rhenish Symphony, which has a religious procession in as its fourth movement out of 5. But this, I can't help but think, was an opportunity for reconciliation, a sense of Vienna before the war and Vienna after the war, with an interruption in it that can only be described as wrenching, with human almost screaming, never quite that, but a sense of turmoil and anguish. That then, when the calmer, more religious music returns, it still harkens back to the wrenching times. And in this sense of reconciliation after conflict, we still have a sense of music that has changed. Listen carefully when the initial music comes back after this wrenching moment of anguish, that there is an accompanying winding melody that encircles the slow melody with faster, more counterpoint-like accompaniment, reminding me of the Mendelssohn Sinfonia we heard earlier, the second section of that winding melody. This time in Korngold's music, the melody itself winds around and almost constricts the more calm religious music. I think it is a hearkening back to the music of Wagner and even Mendelssohn in a near statement of the Dresden Amen, a chordal progression of that is ecclesiastical, that would accompany music of prayer or chant. It's a cadential Amen that has importance both in Mendelssohn. He wrote it for his Reformation. He quoted it in his Reformation Symphony, and Wagner quoted it in his opera Parsifal. But if you listen to the high strings when they come to this Amen, it never quite quotes it perfectly, and it just continues to rise and rise. I think in a very filmic way, one thinks of souls rising or of the spirit ascending. It's a very effective movement in that way, and perhaps was both effective but also disturbing to the audiences of Vienna. I would have loved to know how they took this musical gesture toward Vienna before, Vienna during, and Vienna afterward, with this gesture from the composer to reconcile. The last movement is swashbuckling. You can imagine Errol Flynn as Robin Hood, leaping from parapet to parapet with his sword and arrow and bow and arrow. It's just very swashbuckling, very, very Hollywood-esque. However, Korngold takes a step back from Hollywood and tries to move into a more traditional form, the counterpoint of the fugue. And you hear him use the initial gesture that you hear in the low strings as the basic materials for a bit of a fugato, a bit of a small fugue, just to remind himself and also the audience that this is more serious music. even as it is a serenade. So I find this music fascinating. It was a discovery for me. It was a necessity for us to program it because of the smaller forces we were allowed on stage. But it was an opportunity to discover a new piece of music for all of us, and to find a piece that has such meaning in terms of when it was composed and for whom it was composed, and how it brings us a little bit closer to the life of a composer, and also the life of music at that time, which was in such flux, and the fact that, frankly, amidst a great deal of devastation, beauty prevails always.